Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Ralf Spenneberg. I work for the open source security GmbH in Steinfurt, Germany. We are a long-term partner of Tribe29. In addition to the product itself, we are offering trainings, consulting and support for Checkmk. This video will show you how to configure VMware monitoring using a VMware ESX server. We'll talk about the VMware API integration in Checkmk, monitoring ESXi hosts and vCenter, and the monitoring of the running guests using Piggyback. And since I'm coming from a security background, we will secure the connection to the VMware system using SSL. We first need a user that is able to log into the ESX server. Instead of using the root user, we should use a dedicated user for Checkmk. So let's first add a user. I'm here logged into my VMware ESX host. I've navigated to host manage and then security and users, and I add a first user here. Let's call this user CMK and give it a password. And let's add the user. Once the user is added, we have to configure the privileges of this user. Right click on the host and go to the permissions. There, add a user and choose the user we just added and configure it to be a read-only user. Close the window and we're done in VMware. Now we go to our Checkmk server. This is Checkmk 2.1, and I go to setup hosts and let me first create a new folder, VMware. This folder will later contain all my ESX hosts. If I have more than one ESX host, it's much easier to configure everything on a folder. Let's save this folder. Now let's go to the API integrations. So go to Setup, VM Cloud Container underneath Agents, choose VMware ESX and add a rule. And here we have to specify the username and the password. We could configure the password here explicitly, but that's not a very good idea. So let's first put the password into the password store. So let's go to Setup, Passwords. Let's add a password to the password store. Let's call this VMware 1, title VMware, password, and let's put the password here. Save. Now let's go back to our VM Cloud Container integration. Choose VMware ESX, add a rule, and enter the username. Choose the password store, and we use the VMware password. Now we have to decide what kind of system we want to query. In my case, it's an ESX server. If you have a vCenter, you might want to choose vCenter, but I will talk about that in a few minutes. Now, VMware uses SSL. The certificate should be checked by Checkmk. We have not yet imported the certificate, so let's just deactivate that for the moment, but I will come back and we will secure that. We'll make sure that Checkmk is able to check the certificate so that man-in-the-middle attacks are not possible. But for the moment, we will deactivate that to just check whether the username and password and everything else is correct. So everything else I will leave on default. I will only add the license usage here, and I will restrict that to my VMware folder. So for every host within the VMware folder, this rule should apply. Let's save that. Now let's go back to my hosts, to my VMware folder. So now let's add the host to the monitoring. But before I can add the host to the monitoring and do a service discovery, I first have to commit my changes. Why do I have to commit my changes? Because the password, which has been stored in the password store, has not yet been committed to the system. So before I'm able to do the service discovery, I have to make sure that the password store is actually committed and everything actually works. So let's commit those changes. Let's add the host I will call this host station8 example.com because I know that this will be the name that is used in the certificate later on. I will add the IP address because this name is not DNS resolvable. And let's go to the service configuration now. Okay, we found several services, several ESX services, and now we can accept those and commit the changes. So we've added our VMware ESX host to our monitoring. And we see information about the data stores, the interfaces, multipathing, the running VMs, and so on. Now let's make sure that this actually works when we do enforce SSL certificate checking. So let's go back to our setup. Let's go to our VMware rule and let's edit this rule and specify that we want to use the host name. If the host name doesn't fit, by the way, you can specify a different host name here as well, but I think it fits in my case. So let me enable SSL certificate checking using the host name I have configured in Checkmk. Let's save that. Let's activate the changes. I've opened the host in Checkmk again, and now I would like to go to the connection test and see whether the connection to the ESX host with activated SSL certificate checking works. And no, it's not working. Why is it not working? Because Checkmk does not trust the certificate which is presented by the ESX host at the moment. We get a certificate verify failed error message here. Well, we need the certificate of the authority that signed the certificate which is used by the ESX server. This now depends a little bit on the origin of the certificate. Either it is signed by your enterprise certificate authority, or you might be using the certificate authority which is prepared by VMware itself, by the VMware installer. In my case, I'm using the certificates which are prepared by the VMware installer, and there might be other ways, but the easiest way to retrieve the certificate of the certificate authority is by logging into the ESX server on the command line using SSH, for example. For that, you have to enable SSH first on the ESX server. So I will copy this and go back to my Checkmk server. And in the Checkmk server, underneath global settings, we can configure trusted certificates or trusted certificate authorities. And here we can add additional certificate authority certificates or chains, and Checkmk will then trust these. So let me paste the contents here. Let's save that. And we will see that we now trust the VMware installer certificate. Let's activate these changes. If we go back to our host and go to the connection tests, they should now be successful. Now we have configured Checkmk to retrieve the information from the ESX server and to even check the certificate which is used by the ESX server, so man-middle attacks are not possible on this connection. In my eyes, this is very important because we are providing credentials on this connection, the username and the password, and we want to make sure that these credentials are secured. If we now look at our ESX server, we see that many services are monitored, many ESX specific services are monitored. We monitor the state of different virtual machines. But of course, there is more to VMware monitoring. VMware does have information about, for example, the number of snapshots each guest has or the amount of memory each guest uses. To show this guest-specific information, Checkmk actually needs to know these guests. So essentially what we need to do is we need to set up these hosts in Checkmk. So let me do that for one of these hosts for the Windows 2.16 machine here at the bottom. So I go to Setup, go to my hosts, and I create a new folder first, and let's call this folder Guests. And let's save that. And let's go into this folder. So let's add host to our monitoring. Let's call it Windows 2016. Let's specify that this system is not available via IP and that we don't have any Checkmk agent installed. And let's go to the service configuration. And we do get some services for this host. We do get some ESX-based services for this host. This is called piggybacking. We will take a look at how this works underneath on the command line in a few seconds. Or when Checkmk accesses the ESX server and retrieves the data from the ESX server, it will retrieve several services which are actually associated with the ESX server itself. But at the same time, it will extract data which is associated more with the virtual machines, with the guests running on the ESX server. And that data is then, we call it piggybacking, assigned to those hosts. And it will be displayed as soon as Checkmk knows these hosts. So if we create hosts in our Checkmk with the corresponding name, the name must match the name of the guest in ESX. These services are there discovered and then monitored by Checkmk. So let me do an accept all and let's activate the changes. The directory which is used is temp Checkmk piggyback. And here we see the hosts that have piggybacked data. So here's our Windows 2016. Those are directories. Let's take a look into this directory. And we'll see that there's one source. It's station8example.com. This piggyback data comes from. And if we take a look at this file, see the VMware information in here. So that's the way this works. If we take a look at our host here, we can even see that in the output of our Checkmk agent, we see that piggyback data is processed and the source is station8example.com. One host may have several piggyback sources and they can all be combined in that host. Sometimes you might have guests which have a Checkmk agent installed and you want to monitor the Checkmk agent on the guest as well. So how does it work? Well, what we do is we go to that host and to the host configuration and we have to specify the IP address so that this host is accessible. And then we can connect to the Checkmk agent as well and retrieve that information as well. So if we have a Checkmk agent running on that host, we can then connect to that agent as well, retrieve those services in addition to the ESX service we have already monitored. So let's accept all and let's commit the changes. Sometimes you might have hosts which have a different name than the name that is used in the ESX host. So let me add a host here and let me call it test. Let's turn off the IP protocol and the API integrations. And if I go to the service configuration, of course I don't get any services because which host should that be? My Checkmk knows about several guests on the ESX server, but there's no guest which is called test. So sometimes you might have such setups where the name you're using in Checkmk and the name which is used on the ESX host don't match. What can you do? Well, there is a rule which can be used to translate host names for piggybacked hosts. And here we can either, for example, strip domains from full qualified domain names or do simple case translations, or we can do explicit host name mappings. So that's what I want to do here now. So I know there's a host which is called prod AD in ESX, and that should be translated to test in Checkmk. Let's save that. Let's activate these changes. So what we've created that rule for the hostname translation, we have to know that the hostname translation only occurs when the data is retrieved from the source. So before we can go to the host test again and can do a rediscovery of the services, we have to make sure that the ESX server actually is polled for this data. So let me go to my station 8 example.com and let's do a reschedule check so that the data is retrieved again. If we now go to the command line, we see that a new folder test is created, and this now contains the piggyback data for the host test. So let's go to the host test and let's do a service discovery here. And now we see the ESX service here as well. Because of the piggybacking, we see that the original name is prod AD, but because of the piggybacking, this data is now assigned to the host test. Let's accept all and let's activate the changes. Okay, that's VMware monitoring with Checkmk. Now there's one more thing I have to tell you, which I unfortunately cannot demonstrate at the moment because I don't have a vCenter here. Sometimes you might have, or very often probably, you might have a larger environment where you have several ESX hosts and a vCenter which is managing these hosts. And the idea of the vCenter is that the vCenter is used to manage these ESX hosts. You actually don't have to know where a virtual machine is running, and you can migrate virtual machines live while they are running from one ESX host to the other ESX host, and so on. If you monitor such an environment, what you could do is you could just monitor the vCenter, because the vCenter tells you everything about the storages and about the virtual machines. But unfortunately, you do not get host-specific ESX, host-specific information, like the network card, the CPU load on the ESX host, and so on. Therefore, you might want to monitor the ESX host as well. But then you have much information several times in Checkmk. So for example, each ESX host is connected probably to your central storage system. So you will have several identical services on each ESX host which give you information about the storage you're using. And that's redundant, it's not necessary. On the other hand, if you actually monitor the guests on the ESX host, then if you live migrate one guest from one ESX host to the other ESX host, it is gone on the first one and it will appear on the second one, and Checkmk is not really capable of dealing with that. So in such environments, it is recommended to actually monitor both the vCenter and the ESX hosts, but using two different separate routes. I hope you found this video informative. If you did, please leave a thumbs up and like the video and maybe subscribe to the channel. This very much helps the channel and this video, and will make sure that this video will be promoted to other users as well. If you have questions, don't hesitate to contact us. If you need support, training, and so on, we are here to help you. Thank you very much.